Hello, I'm Aloysius, and I'm the owner of Haunted Harbor Tours, and welcome to another unscripted horror story, where I tell the true stories of history, folklore, and all of that great jazz. It's been a while since I've done one of these, and I'm very excited. It's taken a long time to get the story of Bloody Benders ready to be told. I've recorded this probably 1,000 times since I opened my channel, but I've never really felt comfortable doing this story, and there's a reason for that. This story deals with violence not just against man and not just against man and woman, but it deals in violence against defenseless children. And there is a couple of moments in this story that will haunt you. I mean, this is a haunting tale. The Benders were real people. This is not the folklore story of the zombie mama who was brought back from the grave to feed her child after death. This is the story of very real, very terrifying people up there with the likes of Charlie Manson, Ed Gein, and the rest of the terrifying list of American psychopaths that have existed. I would say this family, though early in American history, they kind of stood alone. They killed at least 20 people. Most likely many, many more. That's my warning. That's what I want to warn you about that. Now know this, I am not going to flash gory, horrific images on this channel ever. Okay? That's not what I'm about. You know, my thumbnail, yeah, okay. My thumbnails can be pretty disturbing, and you know, these paintings over here, I've been told they're a little unsettling. There's no jump scares. There's no images that you have to close your browser for. That the story itself is supposed to scare you. The imagination of your own mind is supposed to scare you. And that's why I'm going without all that flashy shit. Now that I've given my warning, the fact that the Bloody Benders are, horrific and horrible. I also, this is going to deal a lot with spiritualism. And so before we get to the Bloody Benders and their spiritualist community in Kansas, I'd like to first start by kind of explaining the spiritualist movement. The fact of the matter is, spiritualism is not, it's not meditation. It's not trying to have a higher connection to what we consider to be spiritual today. Spiritualism is literally spirit, the ghost-ism. It is the idea that we can communicate with the dead, we can reach out, the dead can contact us through possession, through seance, through all these different forms. The spiritualist movement began in New York in 1848 with the Fox sisters. They're the founders of the spiritualist movement. These young women moved in with their parents into this new house, and they found that if they knocked on the pipes, it would go up the pipe and fill the other rooms. And the sisters were able to convince first their parents and then, an entire community that their house was haunted, and they were communicating with these spirits. They began to perform what became known as seances, and from there it took off. It was particularly popular in New York City. There were a lot of people who wanted to communicate with dead relatives. It was very divisive. There were a lot of people obviously calling them hoaxes and frauds, even me, somebody who merely tells a ghost story, just the simple act of telling a ghost story will often get me called a fraud. These people were, charging people money, trying to make profit off of somebody's loss, not telling a story of somebody who had died in a long bygone era, but, trying to make money off of the family members who just want to be able to communicate and say, we miss you, we love you, what have you. And there was a lot of contention. There are a lot of accounts, firsthand testimonies of, we went to this seance, the table started to lift, there were bumps, there were all of these things, and then a man stood, he opened up the counter and found a child in there knocking at well-timed moments. A bunch of people busted into a seance and said, you gotta stop. They flipped a bunch of tables, and the man leading the seance attacked and actually killed a man. Now that's definitely something that I'm going to cover in the near future. The spiritualist community, they were getting a lot of grief. A lot of religious authorities were were saying this is sacrilege, this is witchcraft, this is not allowed. Among the spiritualists, there was desire to be able to get away from New York, get away from the heated presence of all of these people who just want to bring them harm, to get off and go somewhere far off. Starting in 1870, a bunch of spiritualists left for Kansas. They left for a place that didn't even have a town. In fact, it would be 8 months after they arrived that the town of Cherryvale was founded and actually created. John Bender Sr. and John Bender Jr. arrived in Kansas first. John Jr. is somewhere between an imbecile and a savant. It's kind of hard to tell whether or not John Jr. had his wits about him. All accounts of him is that he was the kind of man who would laugh at inopportune and strange times. Now, a lot of people have speculated that this was him trying to dissuade suspicion or interest in him, but much like Hamlet, that of a savant, the kind of man who's going to play insane, you don't suspect him of what he's capable of. John Bender Sr., he played a curmudgeonly old man. He was a curmudgeonly old man. He was definitely the kind of man who would strike fear in you if he was so inclined. These two men picked out a 160-acre plot of land. They built a cabin and a barn with a corral for their livestock, and they built it right along the Osage Trail. If you were traveling further west into the more untamed America, you had to pass by this home, a really heavily traveled road. They had a grocery store there. So this became a very appealing spider's web disguised as a 7-Eleven. After a long day's travel, you see this grocery store, you're gonna stop. Elvira and Kate then arrived. Elvira, John Sr.'s supposed wife, pretended not to be able to speak English. And see, this is where we know for sure that they were charades, they were actors, they were pretending to play these roles. Because Elvira, later on, she revealed that she could speak perfect English. And then we have Kate. Almost patriarch. It's not John Sr. who's the leader of this group. It definitely seems that Kate is the one kind of in charge. She is a spiritualist. She is traveling and doing lectures. She is treating people as a medicine woman. I'm not talking modern medicine. I'm not talking medical science. What I'm referring to is the medicine of old. And she was a healer. In fact, I have newspaper accounts of that healing, which I'll read for you later. Supposedly, Kate and John Bender were married. Although also supposedly they were brother and sister, and supposedly, it's very difficult to say. Although I have found actually somebody who took the time to write out what they read in his journal, which was found on a Bible that was in their home. And in his Bible, he mentions the fact that he and Kate had a child in October. In December, the child passed. So that is indication that John and Kate, were together, despite her free love. May not even be John's child. It's very hard to say. There are a lot of people who say Kate was a prostitute as well, but I mean, at this point, we're just kind of throwing mud at the wall and seeing what sticks. Kate was the most attacked, obviously. A lot of people were traveling on that trail, and they had a grocery store right off the side. A lot of the local people were saying the groceries were cheap and rotten and nasty. It was clearly bought at other places and brought back to their home. They were selling secondhand goods, which we'll get to that as well. And they were generally, it was a shitty place. And even if you were local, they wouldn't serve you. They'd tell you to hit the road. There were many people who said that they walked up to the grocery store at the Bender estate wanting to get a drink. And John Jr. came out laughing with a hammer in his hand. When he figured out they were local, they had to hit the road. They may have gotten their soda or drink, did not have the feeling that they even wanted their business. People start disappearing. So let's get into the murders, why we're all here anyway. So the first body was found in 1871. His skull was crushed in. His throat was cut. This man's last name was Jones, and he was found along Drum Creek. The owner of Drum Creek was suspected in being the murderer, and it was investigated. They had no evidence. They let him go. More bodies start showing up. 2 in February of 1872. Bodies of 2 men. People are starting to disappear that are traveling along the Osage Trail. And it starts getting a bad rap. God, be careful with the Osage. People vanish. W.F. McCruddy is an interesting one. He was a Union soldier. He was a resident of Cedarsville, which is not too far off. Cedarsville shows up a lot in these newspaper articles. And he was actually now practicing, I believe, law. He was contesting a case of land. He stopped at the Benders for refreshments. Now, he was not local. They killed him for a total of $38. They would have questioned him. They would have found out why he was here. They would find out that he's practicing law, which means he has money. And that's what they wanted. They wanted his money. They wanted what he had on him. They wanted all of these things. Now, if he was just in getting refreshments and he's headed off to another area, they would attack you right in the grocery store. Bender Jr. would have hit him in the head. Many people talked about having John Bender Jr. approaching them with a hammer. Many got away. McCruddy did not. So he would have been bashed, and most likely they all would have taken turns stabbing him, cutting his throat, and they dropped him. I know his body was found later buried in the apple orchard. I believe they were selling those apples in the newspapers within the first few weeks. 10 bodies had already been pulled out of that apple orchard. There were quite a few in the basement as well. What they wanted to do, however, was get you to stay for dinner. Kate Bender would usually be the one who extended the invitation for dinner. After a long day's travel that's brought you to Kansas, you're looking for a place to stay the night, they would say, well, stay with us. We'll cook you a nice meal, a nice hot meal. We'll make you the guest of honor at dinner. They would put you at the head of the table. They were not friendly. Their cabin was divided by a covered wagon tarp. By the end, this covered wagon tarp was crimson red, dark shade of red, you know what I mean? This kind of red. It was stained. One man survived because he was so disgusted by that blood-stained tarp. He didn't know it was blood, but it was stained and it was gross, and he didn't want to sit by it. He saw one of the Benders coming out. That's how he got away. But they would sit you at the head of the table, and then through the blood-stained tarp, John Bender Jr., John Bender Sr. would bash your skull in with a hammer, and they would all jump in and start stabbing. They had a trap door. They'd pretty much just Sweeney Todd you right down into the basement. That basement was dingy and dark, and it had puddles of blood when people went in and were discovering what happened. They would then rob you, they would loot your body, and then they'd bury you in the apple orchard. Why weren't they caught sooner? There are 2 possibilities. I don't really like accusing, especially in my industry. I would never accuse somebody of making up a ghost story. If somebody tells me a story of a ghost, an encounter they had, I'm never going to look at them and be like, yeah, you're full of shit. I don't think they believed them even then, and now we don't believe them now. So let's go into some of the reports, the seances, and the neighbors' accounts of the Bloody Benders that I found in these newspapers. This was making media headlines. The 24-hour news cycle back when it was, newspapers. It was a feeding frenzy. So a journalist goes out there. He meets the neighbors, Thomas Tyack and Miss Tyack. He doesn't give her first name. The reason why her name is left out is probably good old 1800s casual sexism. Here's what they said about their time at a seance at the Benders' house. I went to a circle at the Benders last summer. There were present my husband, myself, John, and Kate, and the 2 old Benders. There was no timepiece there, but I think we were there about an hour or an hour and a half. Had I known there were trap doors in the house or such hellish goings on, I would not have gone there. We just sat around with our hands on the table. the old man, Bender, had his hands on the table. My husband was partially under control because he jerked his arms and body. Common stuff for a seance. Testimony from a poor old woman. That's all she's called in this newspaper. The poor old woman was having medical crisis problems, severe medical problems, and she heard Kate Bender was a healer and a spiritualist. So she goes to Kate and requests her service. She has the intention to pay after her healing's been done. And to prove that she's willing to pay, once she knows and is certain this has worked, she gives Kate a saddle. And after a few days, the pain hasn't dissipated. She goes to the Bender house to get her saddle back. But they say, hey, well, give us another shot. We will do it here. They bring her into their dining room. They sit her at the head of the table. They close all the doors, and they all sit with a butcher knife in their hand. So this old lady is now sitting at the head of the table, and they start calling on the spirits, invoking the spirits to take this woman's pain away. And as they're doing this, they begin to take their knives and run it across their throats. Later accounts of this story will say that Elvira Bender tried to stab her and she ran off. What actually happens in this story, in this account, says that she excused herself, said she needed a moment of fresh air. She was feeling the powers of the seance, and she left her bonnet on the table as proof that she was going to come back. And once she was outside, she fled. And as she was trying to get away, she heard footsteps kind of chasing her. She hit onto the brush, and the man's foot, it's hard to tell whether it was John Sr. or John Jr., I'm assuming it was John Jr., continued on, and she crawled for miles trying to get away from the Bender estate, but she was definitely going to be a victim. They were going to kill her for that saddle. And now we arrive at the most tragic part of the tale of the Bloody Benders. The story of George Newton Longcaster and his 18-month-old daughter. This is the reason, this is the moment that I warned you about at the start of the video. If you do not want to hear a tragic tale involving an 18-month little girl, please skip ahead to this timestamp right here. I will make it easy for you to do so, I promise. With that, George Newton Longcaster lost his wife tragically. I believe, now, I can find no sources on this, but it seems, it's implied that he lost his wife in childbirth. It's also implied that Dr. York was his physician and was present for the birth of his child and the loss of George's wife. Dr. York actually sold or gave George the horses that he used to travel. George was bringing his 18-month-old daughter to Iowa to be with his sister. It's tough being a single father, and his sister was going to help him out a bit. And so he was moving to Iowa, and he was never seen or heard from again. Well, that's not quite true. His body was found in the apple orchard. George Newton Longcaster's body was as stabbed as most of the others. His skull was bashed in with a hammer, and underneath his body was his daughter. The 18-month-old little girl, buried alive. It was ridiculous, as these newspapers say. Well, what fortunate it is that she wasn't brought this serious harm, but she was buried alive, which I would say is much worse. Anyway, okay, welcome back to those who skipped ahead. Dr. York, George Newton Longcaster's physician, and the man who sold him his horses, begins to worry about George Newton Longcaster. He gets word that suddenly the horses that he had sold, given to George, were now being sold somewhere else. And they had shown up and were being sold somewhere in Kansas. And so he travels out there. He decides he's going to get to the bottom of this, and he's going to find George and make sure he's okay. He goes out, he gets the team of horses, and he's stopping at various places. Now, while he was traveling out there, he stopped at the Bloody Benders, But then on his way back, he stops again, and he vanishes. One of the York brothers is a senator, and the other York brother is a colonel. Colonel Ed York says, enough's enough. He goes out, he's looking for his brother. He's looking for George. He's looking for why people keep vanishing off of the Osage Trail. The Bloody Benders invite Colonel York and his search party of 75 men to stay the night at dinner, and he refuses. Now, they grab up John Jr., but John Jr. gives them a simpleton's tale of highway robbers that shot at him and leads them off to a far-off cabin. George York apparently held a town meeting in which supposedly John Sr. and John Jr. were present. Now, I cannot find this in the old newspaper testimonies, but a lot of historians in the modern day are saying this occurred. And then a man is traveling along the Osage. He stops at the grocery store of the Benders, and he finds the place abandoned. The covered wagon tarp is still hanging, still crimson red. And he goes, and they get a bunch of people to come out, and they begin to search. And they find a trapdoor, and they go into the basement, and they find blood pooled on the floor of the basement. And they find graves in the apple orchard. And they find George Newton. They find Dr. York. And the Benders got away. There are so many accounts of the arrests of the Benders in newspapers. There are people who suspect that Kate and John Jr. ended up down in a Texas town of criminals, a safe haven for criminals. There are accounts of Elvira and John Sr. getting arrested in Colorado, and Kate Jr. and John Sr. getting arrested other places. There are accounts of Kate and Elvira getting arrested. Everybody's arresting everybody. There are accusations, people sending U.S. Marshals down to Arizona and New Mexico claiming that they have spotted Kate Bender. Supposedly, vigilantes stated that they captured the Benders and they hung them. Well, all except for Kate, who apparently they burned at a stake. Hell, even Little House in the Prairie was apparently, involved in that posse. The father, the patriarch of I don't even know Little House in the Prairie, truth be told. But apparently the father was there, even though they didn't actually live in that part of the area the year they fled, supposedly. I don't really know. But look, there's so many different accounts of the Benders that I could make an entire video just on the various arrests, the various sightings. These guys were like Elvis of the late 1800s, early 1900s. They were as spotted as much as D.B. Cooper or the guy who escaped Alcatraz. Yes, they got away. Yes, that is tragic. These a-holes gotta live long, happy lives, which is horrible. Hey, thanks for watching all the way to the end. I really would appreciate it if you hit subscribe, maybe. If you comment, I'll reply. And I'm also at 500 subscribers. I'm going to be sending a deck of tarot cards to somebody who left a comment in one of my videos. If you subscribe, you can watch a whole bunch of videos as they come out. I'll be telling a lot of different types of ghost stories, stories from around the world, folklore stories, stories of real history. By the way, the property of the Bloody Benders has ghost reports all the time. I didn't really touch on the ghosts because this one's a little too dark and it can just be left to the imagination what the ghosts do. I don't need to go into the details there. Subscribe, comment. I do YouTube reviews and such like that. And you could watch another one of my videos if you haven't seen either of these. Well, they're both really enjoyable. So, check those out. And I'll catch you guys again very soon.